The sun barely rose over the horizon, casting a muted light across the serene waters of the Foix Reservoir. On most days, the stillness of the morning would bring a sense of calm. Today, however, there was only unease. Police officers had cordoned off the area, their vehicles parked haphazardly along the dirt road that led to the edge of the water. The smell of burnt metal and something far worse hung heavy in the air. Yellow police tape fluttered in the gentle breeze, marking off the scene of what had been called in as a suspicious fire. Rosa stood by the shore, her gaze fixed on the twisted remains of the car submerged just a few feet from the bank. Smoke still lingered in the air, the remnants of a blaze that had engulfed the vehicle. But what had captured everyone's attention wasn't just the burnt-out shell of the car, it was the charred body inside. Pedro, the name echoed in her mind as she watched the team of forensic specialists move around the vehicle. His face wasn't visible anymore, his identity only confirmed by the few possessions they had found inside the car. Rosa's breath hitched in her throat, though she tried to remain composed. Pedro, her partner, was dead. A voice broke through the noise of her thoughts. "It looks like he never made it out," said Officer Ruiz, standing beside her. His tone was grave as he pointed toward the driver's seat, where Pedro had been found slumped. The fire had consumed nearly everything, leaving behind only scorched bones and the faint outline of a person who had once been alive. "What do you think happened?" Rosa asked, her voice low. "Hard to say," Ruiz replied, shaking his head. "Could be a suicide, or someone wanted him dead." The words hung in the air, bringing a weight to the scene that wasn't there before. The possibility that Pedro's death had been deliberate sent a chill down Rosa's spine. She could feel the gaze of the other officers on her, whispers of speculation already circulating about how closely she had been tied to Pedro. As the team worked to extract the body, Rosa's mind raced. The last time she had seen Pedro was only 2 nights ago. Their conversation had been brief and distant, and he had seemed preoccupied. Now, standing on the edge of this horrifying discovery, she couldn't shake the feeling that there had been something Pedro wasn't telling her. "Something dark, Rosa?" A voice called out, jolting her back to the present. It was the lead investigator. "We're going to need your statement, considering your close relationship with the deceased." Rosa nodded, though her thoughts remained elsewhere. The reservoir, once a peaceful backdrop, now felt like the epicenter of a much larger tragedy. She turned her back on the scene, the weight of suspicion already settling on her shoulders. This was just the beginning. The charred body of Pedro was only the first revelation in what would become a labyrinth of deceit, scandal, and violence. The local police were quick to react, mobilizing their resources to investigate the shocking discovery at Foix Reservoir. Within hours, the scene was swarming with detectives, forensic experts, and curious onlookers hoping to catch a glimpse of the gruesome crime. The quiet town of Castellet, usually known for its calm and picturesque surroundings, had become the center of a high-profile investigation that was making waves across Barcelona. Detective Vargas, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for detail, stood at the helm of the inquiry. Known for his methodical approach, Vargas wasted no time assigning tasks to his team. Interviews, forensic sweeps, and timeline reconstructions were already in motion. He knew that unraveling the mystery of Pedro's death would be like pulling at a single thread in an intricate web of lies. Start with the obvious connections, Vargas said to his team. Pedro wasn't a nobody. He had a history, friends, enemies, and maybe even secrets. Let's see where it all leads. In the small interrogation room of the local precinct, Rosa sat on one side of the table, her face pale and eyes red from lack of sleep. She had already answered dozens of questions, but each one felt like a jab at the fragile foundation of her life. Sitting across from her, Vargas studied her carefully. "You were Pedro's partner, correct?" he asked, his voice calm but probing. Rosa nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "Yes, we've been together for 3 years." "Were you aware of any threats against him? Anything unusual in his behavior recently?" Rosa hesitated. Pedro had been distant in the weeks leading up to his death, but how could she explain the complexity of their relationship? It wasn't just work that had come between them, it was something darker. "No, no threats that I know of," she finally said. "But he had been under a lot of stress." Vargas scribbled in his notebook, his expression unreadable. "What kind of stress?" "Work," Rosa replied, her voice thin. "He was working on some sensitive cases. It took a toll on him." The detective's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he closed his notebook. "And what about Albert? How does he fit into this?" At the mention of Albert's name, Rosa stiffened. Albert, her ex-boyfriend, was a sore subject she had hoped to avoid. Their relationship had ended badly, and since then, he had been lurking on the edges of her life. But Pedro's death was starting to unravel everything, dragging old ghosts back into the light. "Albert and I dated before Pedro," she explained, her voice tight. "It didn't end well, but he's not involved in this." "Is he the jealous type?" Vargas asked, leaning forward. "Would he have had any reason to want Pedro out of the way?" Rosa clenched her jaw. "No. Albert wouldn't, he wouldn't hurt Pedro. They barely knew each other." Vargas watched her carefully, but he didn't push further. Instead, he stood up, signaling the end of the interview. "We'll be in touch, Ms. Vargas. In the meantime, stay in town. We may need more information." Rosa left the station with a heavy heart, her mind spinning. Pedro was gone, and now the investigation was inching closer to exposing every secret she had tried to bury. But as she walked through the bustling streets of Barcelona, she couldn't shake the feeling that Albert was somehow involved, even if not directly. He had always had a way of complicating things. Albert stood at the bar of a dimly lit tavern, swirling the whiskey in his glass as he listened to the low hum of conversation around him. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the message, another journalist asking for a comment on Pedro's death. He sighed and tossed his phone on the counter, annoyed. The truth was, Albert had been keeping a low profile since the news of Pedro's death broke. He hadn't spoken to Rosa in weeks, but now her name was being dragged into this mess, and by extension, so was his. He hadn't forgotten his history with Rosa, though. Their relationship had been intense, fiery, and ultimately destructive. The breakup had left scars on both of them. And now, with Pedro out of the picture, Old wounds were reopening. Albert took a long sip of his drink and leaned back, his thoughts darkening. He had loved Rosa once, and part of him still did. But he knew better than to get involved in this nightmare. Not now. Not when the eyes of the police were everywhere. But no matter how much he tried to distance himself, he couldn't escape the web of lies that was slowly tightening around all of them. Pedro's death had set off a chain reaction, and whether he liked it or not, Albert knew he was already entangled. Back at the station, Detective Vargas reviewed the latest reports with his team. Pedro's past was more complicated than they had initially thought. Not only had he been involved in controversial cases, but his personal life was a mess of overlapping relationships and secrets. The connections between Rosa and Albert were glaring red flags, and Vargas knew there was more to this story than anyone was letting on. As the pieces began to fall into place, Vargas couldn't shake the feeling that what they were dealing with wasn't just a simple crime. It was the product of years of deceit, manipulation, and perhaps even betrayal. The web of lies was growing thicker, and soon, someone was going to get caught. The Foix Reservoir incident had exploded into a full-blown media circus, with reporters and news vans swarming the streets outside the police station. Within hours of Pedro's charred body being discovered, the headlines splashed across every major news outlet in Barcelona. From tabloid journalists to national broadcasters, everyone was speculating about the mysterious death of a decorated police officer in such a gruesome manner. Police officer found dead, Foix Reservoir scandal, one headline blared in bold red letters. Others followed with similar urgency: was it murder or suicide? And the dark secrets of Officer Pedro. Inside the press room, the atmosphere was tense as reporters clamored for answers. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in the faces of anyone who stepped outside the police station, and every snippet of information was blown into a full-blown conspiracy theory. Rosa, who had managed to avoid the journalists for most of the day, found herself cornered as she exited the station. "Ms. Vargas. Ms. Vargas. What can you tell us about your relationship with Pedro?" one reporter shouted, shoving a microphone dangerously close to her face. "Is it true you were romantically involved with the victim?" another chimed in, their voice louder than the rest. Rosa froze for a moment, stunned by the barrage of questions. She had known the media would eventually catch wind of her connection to Pedro, but she hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. She pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding as the reporters followed her, their questions turning nastier. Was Pedro involved in any illegal activities? Are you under investigation too? Did your ex-boyfriend have a motive to kill him? The questions dug into her like knives, each one more intrusive than the last. She finally managed to escape to the relative safety of her car, slamming the door shut as the reporters banged on her windows. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. This was only the beginning. The media frenzy was going to get worse, and her life was about to be put under a microscope. Across town, Albert sat at a small cafe, watching the news unfold on the TV mounted above the counter. His face was stony as he listened to the anchors discuss Pedro's death with the kind of dramatic flair reserved for a political scandal or a celebrity arrest. New developments in the death of Officer Pedro have raised questions about his past. Sources suggest he may have been involved in questionable activities within the police department, the anchor said, her voice tinged with curiosity. Albert clenched his jaw. They didn't know anything yet, but that didn't stop them from speculating. His phone buzzed on the table, another call from a journalist, no doubt. He ignored it, taking a sip of his coffee as the news segment continued. We've received unconfirmed reports that Officer Pedro had a complicated personal life, which may have contributed to his untimely death. Rumors of an affair, a love triangle, and possibly even criminal connections have begun to surface, the anchor continued. Albert turned his attention back to his phone, scrolling through the countless missed calls and messages. The media had turned the death of his ex-girlfriend's partner into a sordid spectacle, and he knew it was only a matter of time before his name got dragged deeper into the mud. He could already see the headlines forming in his mind: ex-boyfriend linked to officer's mysterious death. But there was nothing he could do. The media was a machine, and once it had a story, it wouldn't let go. At the police station, Detective Vargas was already feeling the pressure from the higher-ups. The media frenzy had complicated things, and the speculation surrounding Pedro's death had painted the department in a negative light. Whispers about Pedro's involvement in illegal activities were gaining traction, and if the investigation didn't produce answers soon, it would tarnish not only Pedro's legacy but the entire police force. Vargas stood in front of the assembled press for an official statement, the flashing cameras and bright lights making it difficult to focus. He knew he had to be careful with his words, but the public needed reassurance that the investigation was in capable hands. At this time, we are conducting a thorough investigation into the circumstances surrounding Officer Pedro's death, Vargas began, his voice steady. We ask for patience and respect as we gather more information. Any speculation about his personal life or professional conduct is just that, speculation. We will not comment on rumors. The reporters, of course, were unsatisfied with his carefully worded statement. They bombarded him with questions anyway, probing for anything that could lead to a scandalous headline: is it true Officer Pedro was involved in corrupt practices? Can you confirm or deny the allegations of an affair with his partner, Rosa? What about his connections to organized crime? Were those being investigated before his death? Vargas dodged the questions as best he could, but he knew the media wasn't going to back down. The case had become more than just a murder investigation, it was a public relations nightmare. By the next morning, the media storm had grown even more intense. The papers were littered with accusations, gossip, and wild theories about Pedro's death. Some claimed he had been a whistleblower, exposing corruption within the force, others hinted that he had enemies within criminal circles. And, of course, the love triangle between Rosa, Pedro, and Albert was splashed across the front pages of tabloids with lurid details. Rosa's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters and curious acquaintances. Every time she glanced at a news broadcast or overheard someone talking about the case, it felt like a dagger twisting in her chest. Her relationship with Pedro was being dissected by strangers, and she couldn't escape the rumors. Worse still, the growing whispers about Pedro's involvement in illegal activities made her question just how well she had known the man she'd loved. As she watched the media spin out of control, Rosa realized one horrifying truth: she wasn't just fighting for Pedro's memory, she was fighting to protect herself from becoming the next scandal. The sun was setting over Barcelona, casting a warm, golden hue over the city's skyline. In the cozy kitchen of a modest apartment, Rosa was preparing dinner. The smell of sautéed onions and garlic filled the room, a comforting aroma that was both familiar and soothing. Pedro was there, his presence a steady comfort. He was leaning against the counter, his eyes watching her with an intensity that made her heart flutter. It was moments like these that reminded her why she had fallen for him. His laughter, his easy smile, the way he would wrap her in his arms after a long day, everything about their time together felt perfect, despite the pressures of their demanding jobs. "Did you hear about the new case?" Pedro asked, breaking the silence. He was always immersed in work, even at home. Rosa looked up from the stove, her brow furrowing. "You never stop talking about work, do you?" Pedro chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I can't help it. It's what I do." Their relationship had been one of passion and intensity. From the very start, there was a connection between them that was undeniable. They had met on the job, two ambitious officers with a shared dedication to justice. Their bond had quickly evolved into something more, something deeper. They'd found solace in each other, a rare and precious thing in their line of work, but the honeymoon phase was short-lived. As time went on, the pressures of their careers began to take their toll. Pedro's job was demanding, filled with long hours and high-stakes cases that left him exhausted and irritable. Rosa's own work was no less stressful, and the demands of their professional lives often seeped into their personal time. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony overlooking the city, Pedro's demeanor was unusually distant. Rosa could sense a change in him, a growing frustration that seemed to stem from more than just work. "Is something bothering you?" Rosa asked softly, reaching out to touch his hand. Pedro sighed, staring out at the horizon. "It's just, things are getting complicated. The cases we're handling, the corruption, the politics, it's all too much." Rosa squeezed his hand, trying to offer comfort. "You don't have to carry it all alone. We can talk about it." Pedro shook his head, pulling away slightly. "It's not that simple. There are things I can't share with you." The distance between them grew, and though Rosa tried to bridge it with patience and understanding, Pedro's secrets remained locked away. The strain on their relationship became palpable, manifesting in arguments and unspoken resentments. As the months passed, Rosa found herself grappling with her own struggles. The demands of her job, coupled with the growing distance between her and Pedro, began to weigh heavily on her. She tried to remain strong, to keep her professional and personal lives from colliding, but the pressure was relentless. Late at night, Rosa would sit alone in their apartment, staring at the empty space beside her in bed. The silence was deafening, and the absence of Pedro's presence felt like a void she couldn't fill. She tried to throw herself into her work, seeking solace in her duties, but the unspoken issues between her and Pedro lingered, unresolved. She began to question her own choices, whether she had been naive to think their relationship could withstand the pressures they faced. The weight of her own insecurities and the feeling of inadequacy gnawed at her. Her colleagues sensed her distress, but she kept up appearances, not wanting to reveal the cracks in her carefully maintained facade. Amidst the turmoil of her relationship with Pedro, Rosa's past with Albert continued to haunt her. Their breakup had been tumultuous, filled with arguments and heartbreak. Albert had been a significant part of her life before Pedro, and though they had gone their separate ways, he had never truly disappeared from her mind. Albert's reappearance in her life had been unexpected. Their interactions were fraught with tension, an undercurrent of unresolved emotions simmering beneath the surface. When they had crossed paths again, it had been during a period of vulnerability for Rosa. Her relationship with Pedro was faltering, and the comfort Albert offered seemed like a fleeting escape. They had rekindled their connection briefly, but it had been a mistake, a desperate attempt to recapture something that had long since faded. Rosa had been drawn to Albert's familiarity, but the baggage of their past only complicated things further. Their brief affair had ended badly, leaving both of them with lingering feelings and unresolved issues. As the media scrutiny intensified, Rosa's history with Albert was beginning to come to light. The public's focus on her personal life, particularly her entanglement with both Pedro and Albert, made it difficult for her to escape the shadows of her past. The complexities of her relationships were being scrutinized, adding to the mounting pressure she felt. Rosa sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by the remnants of her shattered life. The walls seemed to close in on her, the weight of her secrets and struggles pressing down with relentless force. The media frenzy and the investigation into Pedro's death had uncovered more than just a murder. It had exposed the raw, vulnerable parts of her life that she had tried so hard to keep hidden. As she looked out the window at the city below, Rosa knew that the coming days would be a battle, not just to clear her name, but to come to terms with the choices she had made and the secrets that had come to light. Albert's return to Rosa's life had been unexpected and, to say the least, awkward. It had been months since their brief and tumultuous reunion, and he had managed to keep a low profile. His life had drifted back into the familiar routine of working odd jobs and avoiding the spotlight. However, the tragic news of Pedro's death brought Albert back into the limelight, and into Rosa's life once more. The first encounter happened on a rainy afternoon, a few days after Pedro's body had been discovered. Rosa was in a quiet cafe, trying to escape the relentless media and her own spiraling thoughts. As she sipped her coffee and stared out the window, lost in her own world, she heard a familiar voice, "Rosa." She looked up, her eyes widening in shock. Albert stood at the entrance, drenched from the rain, his expression a mixture of concern and apprehension. "Albert," she said, her voice catching in her throat. "What are you doing here?" Albert shrugged, stepping inside and shaking off the rain. "I heard about Pedro. I thought I should check in on you." Rosa was taken aback by his unexpected visit. She hadn't seen him in months, and their last encounter had ended with a lot of unresolved feelings. Seeing him now, standing there with that familiar, uncertain look on his face, stirred up a wave of emotions she wasn't prepared to handle. "Why now?" Rosa asked, her voice strained. "Why are you here?" Albert took a seat across from her, his face shadowed with a mix of regret and concern. "I didn't know how else to reach out. I saw the news, and I thought you might need someone to talk to." The awkward silence that followed was filled with the hum of the cafe's background noise and the occasional clink of cutlery. Rosa's mind raced as she tried to reconcile Albert's presence with the chaos of her current situation. "You've been out of touch for so long," Rosa finally said. "I don't know if this is the right time for this." Albert looked down, fiddling with the edge of his wet coat. "I know. But when I saw what happened to Pedro, I realized I should have been there for you. I'm sorry for everything." Rosa took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. Albert's apology felt like a small consolation amidst the storm of her life, but it didn't erase the past or the complications it brought. "It's a mess," she said softly. "Everything's falling apart. Pedro's death, the media, everything's just too much." Albert reached across the table, placing his hand over hers in a gesture of comfort. "I know it's been hard. I can't imagine what you're going through, but I'm here now. If you need to talk, I'm willing to listen." Rosa nodded, her heart heavy. She wasn't sure how to feel about Albert's return or what it meant for her current situation, but she knew she needed support. The lines between past and present had blurred, and she was left navigating the fallout of Pedro's death while trying to come to terms with her own feelings. As the days passed, Albert's presence became a fixture in Rosa's life. His initial visit had been followed by more meetings, where he offered his support and attempted to bridge the gap between them. However, the shadow of Pedro's death loomed large over their interactions. Albert was visibly shaken by Pedro's death. Although he had been out of touch with Rosa, he had heard enough about Pedro through mutual acquaintances to know that his death was a devastating blow. The media coverage only added to the horror, painting a picture of a man whose life had been marred by scandal and mystery. Sitting in his modest apartment, Albert replayed the news reports over and over. Each mention of Pedro's name, each detail about the case, felt like a personal blow. Pedro had been a part of his life, if not in the most positive of ways, but his death was a stark reminder of how interconnected their lives had been. Albert's reaction was a mixture of guilt, anger, and sorrow. He felt guilty for not being there for Rosa during such a crucial time. Their shared history made Pedro's death even more personal, and Albert couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed both Rosa and Pedro. "I should have been there for you," Albert said to Rosa during one of their conversations. "Maybe things could have been different." Rosa shook her head, her eyes weary. "We can't change the past, Albert. What's important now is dealing with what's happening." Albert nodded, but the weight of his guilt was evident. He began to question his own decisions and the choices he had made. The media frenzy surrounding Pedro's death and the scrutiny on Rosa made Albert feel like he was part of a larger, more disturbing narrative that he couldn't escape. Despite his best efforts to support Rosa, Albert found himself caught in the same storm of scandal and speculation. His own past with Rosa and the unresolved tension between them only complicated matters further. He was trying to be a friend, but the boundaries between past and present were becoming increasingly blurred. As the investigation into Pedro's death continued, Albert knew that his reappearance in Rosa's life had brought both comfort and complexity. The road ahead was uncertain, and navigating the fallout from Pedro's death required him to confront not only his own feelings but the tangled web of relationships that had been exposed. The sterile air inside the Barcelona forensic lab was heavy with tension as detectives gathered around the lead forensic examiner. The results from Pedro's autopsy had finally come in, and the findings would either confirm or upend the current theories surrounding his death. Dr. Marta Alvarez, the head of the forensic team, stood before a large whiteboard where photographs of Pedro's charred remains were displayed. The images were disturbing, a grim reminder of the brutality of the crime. The investigator's eyes fixated on the forensic report she held in her hands. As you all know, Dr. Alvarez began, the body was found severely burned inside the car, but our analysis shows that the fire didn't start naturally. There are traces of accelerants, petrol, most likely, used to ignite the flames. The room was silent as the significance of her words settled in. This wasn't just an accident or a random crime. Pedro had been deliberately burned, and someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. Was there anything found on the body that could suggest foul play before the fire? Detective Carlos asked, leaning forward in his chair. Doctor Alvarez nodded. Yes, we found bruising around the neck and upper torso that suggests Pedro was restrained before the fire. There's a strong indication that he was unconscious or possibly already deceased when the fire was set. Cause of death is still undetermined, but asphyxiation or blunt force trauma are possibilities. A murmur ran through the room. The brutality of the crime was becoming clearer with each revelation. Pedro hadn't just been murdered, he had been incapacitated and then burned in a twisted attempt to erase the evidence. What about the car? Asked Inspector Montoya, the lead investigator on the case. The car itself had no mechanical faults, Dr. Alvarez replied. It was deliberately set on fire. We also found a few traces of DNA inside the vehicle, but it's mixed with Pedro's, so it will take some time to isolate any potential suspects. The detective team exchanged glances. This was no ordinary crime scene. Whoever had killed Pedro had planned the crime meticulously, ensuring there were few clues left behind. But there was something else, a lingering sense that Pedro's death wasn't just about silencing him. It felt personal, calculated. Someone wanted Pedro erased, not just from the world, but from the narrative of his life. As the forensic team continued their analysis, the detectives began to dig deeper into Pedro's background, hoping to uncover any leads that might explain why someone would want him dead. What they found was not the pristine record of a model police officer, but something much darker. Pedro had always been seen as a diligent officer, someone who upheld the law with unwavering commitment. But as they combed through his personal records, a different picture began to emerge. Behind closed doors, Pedro had been living a life of secrets. Old case files from years prior were reopened, and names began to surface: criminals Pedro had apprehended, informants he had used, and colleagues he had clashed with. Some of these individuals had mysteriously disappeared, and while nothing could directly link Pedro to their fates, there were rumors that he had been involved in extrajudicial methods of dealing with crime. Detective Carlos sat at his desk, reading through a report from 5 years ago. It detailed the arrest of a notorious drug dealer who had vanished after Pedro had taken him in for questioning. The case had been buried, but now, it was impossible to ignore. Pedro had a pattern of operating in the gray areas of the law. There's more, Montoya said, walking into Carlos' office with a file in his hand. Pedro's name came up in an internal affairs investigation a few years back. Bribery, extortion, it's all in here, but the investigation was dropped. No formal charges. Carlos flipped through the pages, his brows furrowing. So Pedro wasn't as clean as we thought. Montoya nodded grimly. It gets worse. We also found evidence that Pedro may have had ties to organized crime. A local gang that's been running smuggling operations along the coast. It's possible Pedro was working both sides, using his position as a cop to protect the criminals he was supposed to be arresting. The more they uncovered, the darker Pedro's life became. He had been living a double life, straddling the line between law enforcement and criminal activity. The people he had been working with were dangerous, and it was becoming clear that his death might have been a result of these illicit dealings. The discovery of Pedro's ties to organized crime sent shockwaves through the police department. The possibility that one of their own had been involved in illegal activities was a devastating blow to the department's credibility. It also provided a new angle for the investigation. The detectives turned their focus to Pedro's recent cases, specifically those involving high-profile criminals and smuggling rings. One name kept coming up, a powerful figure in the Barcelona underworld, known only as El Cazador. El Cazador had a reputation for being untouchable, running his operations with precision and evading law enforcement at every turn. If Pedro had been working with, or against, him, it could explain why he had been killed so violently. Rosa, too, was pulled into the spotlight as the investigation deepened. Her close relationship with Pedro raised questions about how much she knew about his activities. Was she an innocent bystander, or had she been complicit in his criminal dealings? The media began to speculate wildly, casting doubt on her character and fueling the public's fascination with the case. Albert, who had known Pedro for years, found himself grappling with the revelations. He had always seen Pedro as a rival, but he had never imagined that Pedro had such a dark side. Albert's guilt deepened as he questioned whether his own history with Pedro and Rosa had somehow played a role in this deadly game. As the detectives continued to uncover the layers of Pedro's secret life, they realized they were dealing with more than just a simple murder. This was a case that involved corruption, betrayal, and power struggles that reached far beyond Pedro's immediate circle. The question now was not just who had killed Pedro, but how far his criminal ties extended, and who else might be implicated in the web of lies that was slowly unraveling. Rosa sat at her kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she stared down at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. The weight of the past few weeks had pressed down on her shoulders like an unbearable burden, leaving her mind swirling in a fog of confusion and guilt. The investigation into Pedro's death was unraveling layers of his life she hadn't known, or perhaps had refused to see. And now, Albert had returned, complicating everything even further. Her relationship with Pedro had always been complicated. He was intense, protective to the point of being possessive, and their life together had been marked by moments of warmth and flashes of tension. There were days when Rosa felt as if Pedro had been hiding something from her, but she had always pushed those thoughts aside, choosing to believe in the man she thought she knew. And now he was gone, murdered in the most horrific way imaginable, and she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that she hadn't known him at all. Her thoughts drifted back to Albert, the man she had once loved deeply before everything fell apart. Their relationship had ended badly, yet there was still a part of her that had never let him go. And now he was back in her life, showing up just when she needed someone the most. But his reappearance stirred conflicting emotions, reminders of past betrayals and unhealed wounds. The memories of her time with Albert before Pedro came into her life surfaced unbidden. There had been passion, undeniable chemistry, but there had also been volatility. Their fights had been as fiery as their love, and when it ended, it was as though a storm had passed through both of their lives, leaving them broken and confused. Pedro had been her shelter from that storm, or so she had thought. But now, with the investigation painting a much darker picture of Pedro's life, Rosa found herself questioning everything. Had she chosen Pedro because he seemed stable, dependable, everything Albert wasn't? Or had she been running from something, trying to bury the unresolved emotions she still harbored for Albert? Every passing day felt like a tug-of-war between the life she had built with Pedro and the unresolved feelings she had for Albert. Her internal conflict grew deeper as she realized that the lines between love, loyalty, and deceit were becoming impossibly blurred. The tension between Rosa and Albert had been simmering ever since his reappearance, but it was starting to boil over. Their meetings, which had started as attempts to provide Rosa with comfort and support, quickly began to take on a more charged and uncomfortable tone. Albert's frustration with the ongoing investigation was palpable. He couldn't stand the way Pedro's name was being dragged through the mud, nor could he ignore the way Rosa was reacting to the revelations. Her growing distance, her doubts about Pedro, and the unresolved emotions between them were pushing Albert to the edge point. One evening, after another grueling day of scrutiny from the police and the media, Rosa and Albert found themselves in her apartment once more. Rosa was sitting on the couch, staring vacantly at the television, while Albert paced back and forth, his frustration building. "I don't understand why you're so conflicted, Rosa," Albert said, his voice rising. "Pedro wasn't the man you thought he was. Everything that's coming out in this investigation shows that he was living a double life. You need to accept that." Rosa looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and defiance. "It's not that simple, Albert. I loved him. Even if he made mistakes, even if he wasn't perfect, I can't just turn off my feelings. And what about you? You didn't exactly stick around when things got tough between us." Albert's face hardened, his jaw clenched. "I made mistakes too, Rosa, but this is different. Pedro was involved in things, dangerous things. How can you still be defending him after everything we found out?" Rosa stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'm not defending him. But you don't get to judge me for being confused. You don't get to come back into my life and expect everything to just fall into place because Pedro's gone. This is more complicated than you realize." Albert stopped pacing, turning to face her with a look of exasperation. "So, what? You're still in love with him? Even after everything that's come out?" The question hung in the air like a lead weight. Rosa didn't have an easy answer. She had loved Pedro, deeply, passionately, but the cracks in their relationship had been there long before his death. And now, with Albert standing in front of her, so much of the past was coming back, flooding her with unresolved feelings. "I don't know," Rosa finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how I feel anymore. Everything's so messed up. Pedro is dead, and I'm being pulled in 100 different directions. I don't know." Albert shook his head, his frustration morphing into something else, something more painful. You've always done this, Rosa. You've always let yourself get caught in the middle. First with me, then with Pedro. You're always so afraid to make a choice. Rosa's eyes filled with tears, her emotions unraveling in front of him. You don't understand, Albert. It's not about being afraid to make a choice. It's about not knowing which choice is the right one. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension and unspoken words. Both of them were caught in the web of their past, haunted by the decisions they had made and the ones they hadn't. Finally, Albert broke the silence, his voice softer but still charged with emotion. I didn't come back to hurt you, Rosa. But I can't watch you destroy yourself over Pedro. He's gone, and he wasn't the man you thought he was. You need to let go. Rosa wiped her tears away, her expression hardening. It's not that easy, Albert. I can't just let go. Not yet. Albert took a step back, his frustration giving way to resignation. Then I guess there's nothing more to say. As Albert turned to leave, Rosa felt a pang of regret. But she couldn't bring herself to call him back. The distance between them had grown too great, and with Pedro's death still casting a long shadow over her life, she wasn't sure how to bridge the gap. The door closed behind Albert, and Rosa was left alone, once again trapped in the middle of a deceitful past and an uncertain future. As the investigation deepened, more details emerged about the complicated dynamics between Pedro, Rosa, and Albert. The detectives working the case began to unravel not only Pedro's personal life but also the tension that had long simmered between the three of them. Witnesses and former colleagues came forward with fragmented accounts, each offering glimpses into the strain that had plagued their relationships. It became evident that Pedro's relationship with Rosa had been far from ideal. Behind the public facade of a loving couple, there were cracks in their bond that had grown wider over time. Close friends of Rosa confirmed that she had confided in them about her struggles, how Pedro's possessiveness had suffocated her, how their arguments had become more frequent and intense in the months leading up to his death. Pedro had been a man tormented by his own demons, some of which had come to light during the investigation. His financial dealings were murky, and his connection to dangerous figures in Barcelona's underworld only worsened the situation. Rosa had been caught in the middle of it all, trapped between her loyalty to Pedro and her growing doubts about the life they had built together. Albert's role in this toxic triangle had only heightened the strain. His re-entry into Rosa's life had reignited unresolved feelings, which in turn inflamed Pedro's jealousy. Their shared history, one marked by love, betrayal, and lingering affection, had complicated an already volatile situation. It became clear to the investigators that Pedro had seen Albert as a threat, not just to his relationship with Rosa but also to his carefully constructed life. The detectives interviewed people from Pedro's and Albert's pasts, learning that the rivalry between the two men had extended far beyond their relationships with Rosa. Pedro had once viewed Albert as a friend, but as their lives diverged, jealousy and resentment had taken hold. While Pedro climbed the ranks in the police force, Albert's career had stalled, and his return seemed to bring those old wounds to the surface. As the police pieced together this intricate web of emotions and betrayal, they realized that Pedro's death wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a culmination of years of simmering tensions that had finally boiled over. The investigation revealed even darker truths. In the months leading up to Pedro's murder, there had been several violent confrontations between him, Rosa, and Albert, altercations that had been kept hidden from the public eye but were well known among their close circles. One night in particular stood out. Rosa's neighbor recounted a disturbing event that had taken place just weeks before Pedro's death. The sounds of raised voices and crashing objects had come from their apartment, so loud that it had startled the entire building. When the neighbor knocked on the door to check if everything was all right, Rosa had answered, her face pale, assuring them that it was just a misunderstanding. But the tension in her voice had been unmistakable, and Pedro's threatening silhouette loomed behind her in the doorway. What had started as an argument about Albert had quickly escalated. Pedro had accused Rosa of infidelity, his paranoia consuming him. In a fit of rage, he had thrown objects across the room, and the argument had turned physical. Rosa hadn't reported it to the police, fearing the repercussions it might have on both their careers, but the incident had left her shaken, her trust in Pedro further eroded. Albert, too, had clashed violently with Pedro. The investigation uncovered a confrontation between the two men that had taken place in a secluded area near the reservoir, ironically, the same location where Pedro's body had been found. A hiker who had passed through the area late at night reported seeing two men arguing, their voices rising in anger. The argument had turned physical, with punches thrown before the witness hurried away, too frightened to intervene. He didn't realize the gravity of what he had witnessed until Pedro's charred body was discovered days later. The police now had a clearer picture. The ties between Pedro, Rosa, and Albert had been far from healthy. The toxic nature of their relationships, filled with jealousy, suspicion, and violence, had set the stage for the tragedy that followed. Investigators began to question whether Pedro's death had been a crime of passion, committed by someone deeply entwined in this web of deceit, or whether the violence stemmed from something more sinister and calculated. As the detectives continued to unravel the truth, one thing became certain: the tangled relationships between Pedro, Rosa, and Albert were at the heart of the case. The deeper they dug, the more it seemed that Pedro's death wasn't just a result of outside forces, it was the tragic consequence of the toxic ties that had bound the three together for far too long. As the investigation into Pedro's death pressed forward, detectives began uncovering dark secrets from his past. Pedro had long been regarded as a committed officer, someone who took pride in his work and had climbed the ranks of the Barcelona police force with determination. But beneath that polished exterior lay a history of deep involvement in police corruption, a network of bribes, cover-ups, and secret deals that stretched back for years. The investigation unearthed Pedro's connections to a corrupt inner circle within the police force, a faction that had been working behind the scenes to protect powerful criminal interests in the city. Pedro had once been a rising star, but his fall into this web of corruption had been gradual, starting with small favors in exchange for protection, then escalating to facilitating criminal activities in exchange for money and influence. The investigation revealed that Pedro's hands weren't just dirty, they were covered in the blood of the cases he had buried and the criminals he had shielded. Pedro had begun to rely heavily on the illegal income he was generating through these dealings, particularly as financial pressures mounted in his personal life. His lifestyle had become more extravagant, and with it came the need to keep certain secrets hidden, especially from his colleagues and Rosa. His involvement with these corrupt officers had placed him in dangerous territory from which it would be difficult, if not impossible, to escape. As detectives dug deeper, they discovered that Pedro had started working closely with a crime syndicate involved in drug trafficking, and some suspected he might have been laundering money through his police connections. His work within this underworld had tied him to dangerous individuals who wouldn't hesitate to turn on him if they felt threatened. This connection to organized crime had likely contributed to his growing paranoia and the deterioration of his relationships with both Rosa and Albert. But it wasn't just Pedro's career that had been tainted by his involvement with the corruption within the police force. His personal life had also begun to spiral out of control. The pressure of maintaining his secret life, coupled with the tensions in his relationship with Rosa, had caused him to withdraw emotionally, leaving Rosa feeling isolated and confused. Pedro's descent into corruption had a profound impact on his relationship with Rosa. Once, he had been the strong, protective figure in her life, someone she could rely on. But as the weight of his double life grew heavier, Pedro's behavior changed. He became more secretive, his moods darker, and his temper more unpredictable. He would disappear for hours, sometimes days, on end with little explanation, leaving Rosa to wonder what had happened to the man she had fallen in love with. Rosa, unaware of the full extent of Pedro's involvement in the criminal underworld, had sensed that something was wrong. She had tried to confront him on several occasions, but Pedro always found a way to deflect her concerns, brushing off her questions with vague answers or outright lies. Their arguments became more frequent, often ending with Pedro storming out of the apartment or retreating into silence for days. The strain on their relationship became unbearable when Pedro's financial troubles began to surface. The lavish lifestyle they had grown accustomed to, expensive dinners, frequent vacations, gifts for Rosa, had all been funded by Pedro's illegal earnings. When his income started to dry up due to increasing pressure from his criminal connections, their comfortable life began to crumble. Rosa, who had always valued her independence, started to feel trapped in a life built on lies. Her love for Pedro began to wane, replaced by resentment and confusion. The man she had once trusted implicitly now felt like a stranger, and she found herself turning to Albert for support, reigniting old feelings that complicated her situation even further. But Pedro's corruption wasn't just a matter of money and shady deals, it had bled into his relationships in more insidious ways. The investigation uncovered that Pedro had used his position in the police force to manipulate not only criminal activities but also those closest to him. He had been known to intimidate and threaten anyone who questioned his authority, and there were rumors that he had used his connections to spy on Rosa and Albert, feeding his growing jealousy and paranoia. Rosa's life had become intertwined with Pedro's lies, and as the investigation revealed more of his dark past, it became clear that she had been living in the shadow of a man who was far more dangerous than she had ever realized. The toxic ties between Pedro, Rosa, and Albert weren't just emotional, they were the result of a life Pedro had spent building walls of deceit and corruption around himself. Pedro's past with the corrupt police force had ultimately destroyed everything he held dear, leaving behind only the charred remains of a man whose double life had finally caught up with him. The more the detectives uncovered about Pedro's criminal activities, the clearer it became that his death was not just the result of personal conflicts, it was the inevitable outcome of a life built on secrets, lies, and betrayal. In the end, Pedro's shattered past had not only destroyed him, it had shattered the lives of everyone around him, leaving Rosa and Albert grappling with the fallout of a life they had never fully understood. Rosa and Albert's relationship had always been marked by passion and volatility. What started as a whirlwind romance, full of intensity and excitement, had slowly unraveled into a tangled web of jealousy, mistrust, and unresolved feelings. Their love affair had burned hot and fast, leaving scars that neither of them could fully heal from. Albert had been Rosa's first real love, and their connection had been magnetic from the start. They were inseparable, drawn together by a shared intensity that made their bond feel unbreakable. But as with all things that burn too brightly, their relationship began to consume them. Albert's possessiveness clashed with Rosa's desire for independence, and what once felt like love slowly morphed into control. Their arguments grew fiercer, and the emotional roller coaster they rode together became harder to sustain. Albert's jealousy had always been a point of contention. Even after their breakup, he struggled to let go of Rosa, constantly hovering in the background of her life. When Pedro entered the picture, Albert's resentment only grew, turning their relationship into a battlefield of conflicting emotions. While Albert still harbored feelings for Rosa, his pride wouldn't allow him to admit it. Instead, he pushed her away with his erratic behavior, all while secretly hoping she'd come back to him. Rosa, for her part, was caught between two worlds. On the one hand, she loved Pedro, or at least the version of him she had fallen for in the beginning. But her unresolved feelings for Albert lingered, complicating her life and pulling her in different directions. The emotional turmoil she felt, torn between her past with Albert and her present with Pedro, became unbearable. And yet, she couldn't fully detach herself from Albert, the man who had been her first love and, in many ways, still held a piece of her heart. Their volatile romantic history became one of the key points of interest for the investigators, as they began to dig into the relationships that had driven the events leading up to Pedro's death. Rosa and Albert's past, one filled with passion, heartbreak, and unresolved tension, was seen as a possible motive for the escalating violence between Pedro and Albert. Had their turbulent relationship been a factor in Pedro's murder? Or was there something even darker lying beneath the surface? As investigators continued to peel back the layers of Pedro's life and career, another disturbing revelation emerged: a series of sexual misconduct scandals that had quietly plagued the police department for years. The toxic culture within the force, one that had allowed for the abuse of power, had not only ensnared Pedro but also affected Rosa and several other officers. Rumors of sexual harassment, coercion, and inappropriate relationships had long circulated within the department, but they were often swept under the rug or ignored by higher-ups who didn't want to tarnish the force's reputation. The investigation revealed that Pedro had been implicated in several incidents, though no formal complaints had ever been filed. Women within the department, including Rosa, had endured unwanted advances and inappropriate behavior from male colleagues, many of whom were in positions of power. For Rosa, these experiences had left her feeling trapped in a male-dominated world where speaking out could jeopardize her career. She had learned to navigate the unspoken rules of the department, maintaining a delicate balance between protecting herself and not rocking the boat. Pedro's own participation in this culture had added another layer of complexity to their relationship. While he had never directly harassed Rosa, his complicity in the department's cover-ups had damaged her trust in him, but the scandal didn't end with Pedro. Albert, too, had been implicated in the department's sexual misconduct issues. His relationships with female colleagues had often crossed professional boundaries, and several officers had noted his inappropriate behavior during their time working together. The investigators found that Albert's volatile romantic history with Rosa was not an isolated incident. His treatment of other women in the department had followed a similar pattern of emotional manipulation and control. As the detectives uncovered more about the culture of misconduct within the department, it became clear that the power dynamics at play had shaped not only Pedro and Albert's personal relationships but also their professional lives. The toxic blend of sex, power, and secrecy that permeated the force had created an environment where officers like Pedro and Albert could exploit their positions, leaving a trail of damaged lives in their wake. The revelation of these scandals further complicated the investigation. Was Pedro's murder connected to his involvement in the sexual misconduct cover-ups? Was Rosa a victim of the toxic culture that had shaped her career, or had she been complicit in her silence? And how did Albert's own abuses of power factor into the growing web of deceit? As the investigators delved deeper into the department's secrets, they realized that Pedro's death wasn't just a result of personal grievances. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that had been festering within the police force for years, poisoning everything it touched. The toxic culture of sex, power, and secrets had claimed more than just Pedro's life. It had destroyed the trust and integrity of those who had sworn to uphold the law. As the investigation into Pedro's death intensified, the spotlight began to shift toward Rosa. Once a respected officer known for her sharp instincts and dedication to the force, she now found herself under the harsh gaze of suspicion. Whispers circulated around the department. Was she hiding something? Did she know more about Pedro's involvement in criminal activities than she had let on? And what role did she play in the web of deceit that surrounded his death? Rosa could feel the tension every time she walked through the precinct. Her colleagues, once friendly and supportive, had become distant. Conversations stopped as she approached, and suspicious glances followed her wherever she went. It wasn't just her personal life under scrutiny, her professional reputation was crumbling, with many wondering whether her loyalty to Pedro had clouded her judgment on the job. Rosa's relationship with Pedro had been public knowledge within the department, but now it was viewed through a different lens. Some officers believed that she had turned a blind eye to Pedro's corruption, or worse, that she had been complicit in his dealings. The internal politics of the force made things even more complicated. Some officers, particularly those who had long resented Rosa's rise within the ranks, saw this as an opportunity to undermine her. They spread rumors about her involvement in the scandals within the department, painting her as someone who used her relationships with powerful men to get ahead. The mounting pressure from her colleagues took a toll on Rosa. She had always prided herself on being able to handle the intensity of police work, but now, she felt isolated and vulnerable. Every decision she made, every move she took, was being scrutinized by those waiting for her to slip up. It was a far cry from the solidarity she had once known among her fellow officers. Rosa's situation took a more serious turn when she was summoned for interrogation by the Internal Affairs Unit. As she entered the stark, sterile room, the reality of her predicament became painfully clear. This was no longer just office gossip or whispers behind her back. She was officially under investigation. Two internal affairs officers sat across from her, their expressions unreadable. The room was cold, and the silence felt oppressive as they began to question her about her relationship with Pedro and any knowledge she had of his illegal activities. The questions came hard and fast, probing into every aspect of her life: her personal relationship with Pedro, her history with Albert, and her involvement in the cases Pedro had been assigned to. Rosa tried to stay calm, answering their questions as truthfully as she could. She admitted that her relationship with Pedro had been complicated, but she denied any knowledge of his corrupt dealings. When they pressed her on the details of Pedro's involvement with criminal organizations, she maintained her innocence, stating that she had been blindsided by the revelations about his double life, just like everyone else. But the internal affairs officers weren't convinced. They questioned her about her emotional state in the weeks leading up to Pedro's death, implying that she had motive to harm him or at least cover up his activities. They suggested that her loyalty to Pedro had blinded her to the corruption within the force, or worse, that she had knowingly aided him in his criminal dealings. As the interrogation wore on, Rosa felt the weight of their accusations pressing down on her. They brought up her past with Albert, insinuating that their volatile relationship could have contributed to the violence that led to Pedro's death. The questions became more personal, more invasive, and Rosa struggled to keep her composure. The interrogation left her feeling drained, but more than that, it left her with a growing sense of fear. She had always believed in the system, in the integrity of the police force, but now that very system seemed poised to turn against her. Internal Affairs was determined to find someone to blame for Pedro's death, and Rosa knew that she was a prime suspect, not just because of her personal connections to Pedro and Albert, but because she represented a vulnerability within the department that they needed to address. Rosa left the interrogation room knowing that her career, her reputation, and perhaps even her freedom were on the line. The Internal Affairs Unit had made it clear that they weren't done with her yet, and as the investigation continued to unravel, she found herself wondering how far they would go to pin Pedro's death on her. The walls were closing in, and Rosa was running out of time to prove her innocence. As the investigation unfolded, attention shifted toward Albert, whose behavior began to raise significant questions. On the surface, Albert had always presented himself as a composed and competent officer, a man who took pride in his work and had the respect of many of his colleagues. However, beneath that veneer of professionalism lay a much darker and more complex individual. Albert's reappearance in Rosa's life just before Pedro's death had already aroused suspicion, but now, investigators began to probe deeper into his actions and motivations. While he had claimed to be concerned about Rosa and wanted to support her after Pedro's tragic end, his behavior told a different story. He seemed too eager to insert himself into the investigation, volunteering information that wasn't asked for and showing an unusual level of interest in Pedro's demise. There were moments when Albert's calm facade cracked, revealing an underlying bitterness that suggested his motivations were far from pure. Investigators noticed that Albert seemed almost too invested in painting Pedro in a negative light, eager to point out his flaws, criminal connections, and violent tendencies. While much of what he said about Pedro was true, the intensity with which he pursued this narrative raised red flags. What exactly was Albert trying to achieve? Some began to suspect that his actions were driven by something more personal, perhaps a lingering resentment over losing Rosa to Pedro. Despite the years that had passed, Albert's feelings for Rosa had clearly never disappeared. His possessive nature, which had once driven them apart, now seemed to be resurfacing. The investigators began to wonder if Albert's proximity to the case wasn't just out of concern for Rosa, but a calculated attempt to manipulate the narrative in his favor. The central question investigators grappled with was whether Albert's true motivation was revenge or protection. On the one hand, Albert had plenty of reasons to want Pedro out of the picture. Their rivalry over Rosa had been a source of tension for years, and with Pedro gone, Albert seemed eager to rekindle his relationship with her. It was possible that Albert had seen Pedro's death as an opportunity to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his, but there was also another possibility. Perhaps Albert's actions were motivated by a desire to protect Rosa. He had always been fiercely protective of her, even to the point of being controlling. If Albert had discovered Pedro's involvement in criminal activities or suspected that Rosa was in danger, he might have taken drastic measures to shield her from harm. It was possible that Albert had convinced himself that Pedro's death, whether by his hand or someone else's, was justified if it meant keeping Rosa safe. The ambiguity of Albert's intentions left everyone, including Rosa, uncertain. When confronted by investigators, Albert remained evasive, refusing to answer directly when asked about his feelings for Rosa and whether they played a role in his actions. He maintained that he was only interested in finding out the truth about Pedro's death and insisted that he had nothing to hide. But the inconsistencies in his behavior made it hard for anyone to fully trust him. Rosa, too, was caught in a dilemma. She had once loved Albert, and a part of her still cared for him. But the more she learned about his actions in the aftermath of Pedro's death, the more she began to doubt his sincerity. Was he truly trying to protect her, or was he using her as an excuse to settle old scores? Had his obsessive need to control her life led him down a dark path of revenge? As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Albert's motivations were far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Whether he was driven by love, jealousy, or vengeance, one thing was certain: Albert had secrets of his own, and uncovering them would be key to solving the mystery of Pedro's death. In the end, the question remained: how far was Albert willing to go for Rosa, and at what cost? As the investigation into Pedro's death continued, the case spiraled into a full-blown media spectacle. News outlets across Spain, and even international platforms, picked up the story, sensationalizing every detail. The discovery of a charred body at the Foix Reservoir had been shocking enough, but the revelations about Pedro's toxic relationships, potential corruption within the police force, and sexual scandals turned the investigation into a public obsession. Journalists and reporters descended on Barcelona, eager to uncover every lurid detail they could. Pedro's life became fodder for tabloids, with his personal history dissected in endless reports. The media portrayed him as a deeply flawed figure, mixing rumors of his involvement in criminal activities with allegations of infidelity and violence. Every new piece of information added fuel to the fire, and public interest only grew stronger. Rosa and Albert found themselves thrust into the spotlight, their private lives laid bare for public consumption. Paparazzi followed them relentlessly, capturing every moment of their lives outside the police station and their homes. Rosa, already under intense pressure from the investigation, now had to contend with the invasive scrutiny of the press. Every step she took, every word she said, was analyzed and twisted to fit the media's narrative of a love triangle gone wrong, the public, hungry for updates, engaged in constant speculation. Social media exploded with theories about what had really happened at the Foix Reservoir, with everyone from amateur detectives to conspiracy theorists offering their take on the case. Some believed Pedro had been murdered as part of a cover-up, while others were convinced that Rosa or Albert, or both, had played a role in his death. The case also cast a harsh light on the Barcelona police department, which quickly became the target of widespread criticism. The media framed the department as corrupt and incompetent, fueling public distrust of law enforcement. Reports of Pedro's alleged involvement in criminal activities, combined with the sexual scandals tied to Rosa and Albert, gave the public reason to question the integrity of the entire police force. The department's attempts to manage the narrative only seemed to backfire. Press conferences held by senior officers were met with skepticism, as reporters grilled them on Pedro's past, the potential cover-ups within the force, and the role that Rosa and Albert played in the scandal. The department's reluctance to provide clear answers only deepened the sense of mistrust, leading many to believe that they were hiding something far bigger than Pedro's personal indiscretions. Rosa, once seen as a promising officer with a bright future, was now being painted by the media as a central figure in a scandal that had rocked the force. Her professional achievements were overshadowed by her romantic entanglements with Pedro and Albert, with headlines focusing more on her personal life than her record as an officer. The media's portrayal of Rosa was often unfair and sensationalized, depicting her as either a femme fatale who had manipulated both men or a victim caught in a web of corruption she couldn't escape. Albert, too, wasn't spared. His relationship with Rosa and the timing of his reappearance in her life just before Pedro's death raised suspicions, and the media portrayed him as a man with hidden motives. Some reports painted him as a vengeful ex-lover out for revenge, while others suggested that he was trying to protect Rosa from something much darker. His reputation within the force, once solid, was now in tatters. The media circus surrounding the case only intensified the pressure on the investigation. The public demanded answers, and the police department felt the heat from both the press and their own internal affairs unit. Every misstep, every delay in the investigation, was met with further media criticism, leaving the department scrambling to salvage its reputation. As the frenzy continued, it became clear that the truth about Pedro's death was not just a matter of solving a crime, it was about restoring public trust in the police force. But with so much public scrutiny and so many conflicting narratives, the question remained: could the truth ever truly be separated from the spectacle the media had made of it? Amid the chaos surrounding Pedro's death and the intense media scrutiny, Rosa found herself grappling with an inner turmoil that grew harder to ignore. She had always been a strong and determined woman, but the unraveling events had forced her to confront her deepest emotions. As the investigation pressed on, she took a step back to reflect on her relationships with both Pedro and Albert, two men who had shaped her life in ways she hadn't fully realized until now. Her relationship with Pedro had been complex, to say the least. When they first got together, there had been passion, excitement, and the sense that they could build a future together. Pedro's charisma had drawn her in, and his confidence had made her feel secure. But over time, cracks began to appear. His darker side, the one prone to anger and violence, began to surface. The man she had once admired became unpredictable, and Rosa had started to see the red flags. Despite this, she stayed, hoping that things would change, that she could fix the parts of him that were broken. But Pedro's secrets, the corrupt dealings and hidden connections, had built a wall between them, and she found herself questioning who he truly was. Albert, on the other hand, represented a different kind of relationship. They had been together before Pedro, and their romance had been intense, perhaps too intense. Albert had always been protective of her, but his possessiveness had eventually driven them apart. Even after they ended things, there was an undeniable pull between them. When Albert reappeared in her life after Pedro's death, those old feelings resurfaced, tangled with the unresolved pain of their past. She couldn't deny the comfort she felt with Albert, but there was also a lingering fear that his return was motivated by more than just affection. As Rosa thought about the two men, she realized how much their relationships had shaped her identity. With Pedro, she had tried to be the fixer, the one who could handle the weight of his darkness. With Albert, she had been both loved and controlled, caught between his deep affection and his need to dominate her decisions. Now, with Pedro gone and Albert back in her life, she was left to untangle the web of emotions that had become too tightly wound. At the same time, the pressure from the investigation was closing in on her. Every day felt like a new battle, not just with the investigators but with herself. Rosa had always been good at compartmentalizing, separating her personal life from her professional responsibilities. But now, as the investigation into Pedro's death grew more intense, that boundary was crumbling. Her colleagues were scrutinizing her every move, and the constant questioning from internal affairs felt like a never-ending interrogation. It wasn't just about what she knew, it was about who she had been in the eyes of Pedro and Albert. The media circus only added to her stress. Every headline, every new article, seemed to portray her as either a scheming lover or a woman caught in a scandal beyond her control. The weight of public opinion was suffocating, and she couldn't help but feel trapped in a narrative that had spun out of her hands. It was becoming harder to separate fact from fiction, both in the eyes of the world and in her own mind. Rosa knew that the investigation would soon reach a tipping point. The forensic evidence, the uncovering of Pedro's shady dealings, the growing suspicion surrounding Albert, it was all leading to a conclusion that she wasn't sure she was ready for. But what haunted her most was the question she couldn't yet answer: had she ever really known the men she had loved, or had she been blind to the truth all along? As the days wore on, Rosa found herself caught between the past and the present, her heart torn by the conflicting emotions that surged through her. The weight of the investigation pressed down on her, and she realized that, sooner or later, she would have to choose a path forward, even if it meant confronting truths she had spent years trying to avoid. As the investigation hit a critical point, a key witness emerged, shifting the course of the case in a way no one had expected. The witness, a fellow officer who had worked with Pedro on various assignments, approached the authorities with a mix of guilt and fear. His hesitation in coming forward earlier was evident, but the weight of his knowledge had become too much to bear. During his testimony, the officer revealed disturbing details about Pedro's involvement in an underground network that extended beyond the police force. According to the witness, Pedro had been deeply entrenched in criminal activities that ranged from drug trafficking to extortion. These dealings had been carefully hidden under the guise of legitimate police work, but there were always whispers within the department about Pedro's double life. What shocked the investigators the most was the revelation that Pedro's involvement in these criminal activities had grown more dangerous in the months leading up to his death. The witness spoke of secret meetings with influential figures outside the law, men who operated in the shadows of Barcelona's underworld. Pedro had apparently been in deep, too deep to escape, and it was becoming clear that his death might not have been as simple as a crime of passion or a personal vendetta. As the investigation team dug deeper into the witness's claims, more pieces of evidence began to fall into place. Pedro's phone records, which had been previously overlooked, revealed a series of cryptic messages and late-night calls to known criminals in the city. His bank account showed unusual deposits that far exceeded his police salary, and there were multiple offshore accounts tied to his name, further suggesting that Pedro had been laundering money for the criminal organizations he was involved with. Forensic experts had also uncovered traces of a specialized chemical accelerant used to burn Pedro's body, a substance that was commonly associated with organized crime cleanups. It became clear that whoever had orchestrated Pedro's murder had not intended to leave any traces behind, but their attempts to cover their tracks were unraveling with each new discovery. The deeper they probed, the more damning the evidence became. Files from Pedro's work computer revealed his access to sensitive police information that he had likely sold to criminals. Internal Affairs had long suspected there were moles within the force, but Pedro's name had never been at the top of the list, until now. The once respected officer had been living a double life, hiding behind his badge while pulling strings for some of Barcelona's most dangerous criminals. As Rosa and Albert were looped back into the investigation, the implications of Pedro's criminal life weighed heavily on both of them. For Rosa, the man she had thought she loved was now a stranger, someone capable of unimaginable deceit and betrayal. Albert, meanwhile, grew more suspicious. Had he been drawn into something even darker than he realized when Pedro re-entered Rosa's life? The witness's testimony and the mounting evidence made one thing clear: Pedro's death was far from a simple crime of passion. It was the result of a deadly game he had been playing for far too long. With this new information, the investigators knew they were closing in on the truth. But the deeper they went, the more they realized that Pedro's death wasn't just about him. It was about an entire web of corruption and crime that extended far beyond the confines of his personal life. And now, the people closest to him were in danger of being ensnared in it as well. The weight of the investigation, combined with the shocking revelations about Pedro's double life, began to take a significant toll on Rosa. The constant media attention, coupled with the mounting evidence of Pedro's criminal activities, left her feeling isolated and overwhelmed. Her once clear sense of purpose in her career was now obscured by a fog of doubt and emotional exhaustion. Rosa's mental and emotional state deteriorated rapidly. She found herself unable to sleep, plagued by nightmares of Pedro's last moments and the harrowing implications of his actions. The pressure from internal affairs, the media frenzy, and the scrutinizing eyes of her colleagues only compounded her distress. She felt like she was being pulled in multiple directions, her past with Pedro and Albert colliding with the present crisis in a way that left her feeling fractured. Her work performance began to suffer. She was distracted, making mistakes she would have once avoided, and her interactions with colleagues grew tense. The emotional strain of trying to maintain her composure in public while grappling with the personal betrayal she felt was proving to be too much. Rosa was breaking down under the strain, and it was becoming increasingly evident to those around her. The tension between Rosa and Albert reached a boiling point as the investigation progressed. Albert's return to her life had been marked by a complex mix of old feelings and unresolved issues, but now those feelings were overshadowed by the new revelations about Pedro's criminal activities and the pressures of the investigation. Their confrontation was inevitable, fueled by the emotional strain they were both under. In a heated argument, Rosa confronted Albert about his past betrayals and his recent behavior. The conversation took place in the dimly lit living room of her apartment, where the air was thick with unspoken resentments and the weight of their shared history. Rosa's voice trembled with a mix of anger and sorrow. "You knew more than you let on, didn't you, Albert? About Pedro, about everything. How long were you planning to keep it a secret? Were you just waiting for the right moment to come back into my life?" Albert, his face shadowed by guilt and frustration, struggled to defend himself. "I didn't know everything, Rosa. I tried to protect you, to shield you from the mess Pedro made of his life. But I was drawn back here because I couldn't stand seeing you suffer alone. I never wanted this." Rosa's eyes were filled with tears. "And what about the way you controlled me? The way you tried to manipulate every decision I made? Do you think that was fair? I felt like I was never truly free to make my own choices." Albert's expression softened, a mix of regret and sadness in his eyes. "I know I made mistakes, Rosa. I was jealous, and I thought I was doing what was best for you. But seeing Pedro's world unravel like this, seeing you caught in the middle, it made me realize how wrong I was." Their confrontation laid bare the raw wounds of their past. Rosa's anger was not just about Albert's actions but also about the realization that the man she had once loved had betrayed her trust in ways she hadn't fully grasped until now. Albert's attempts to justify his actions only seemed to deepen her sense of betrayal, leaving her feeling more isolated than ever. As the argument reached its peak, Rosa's emotional walls began to crumble. The pent-up grief, anger, and confusion she had been holding back exploded into a torrent of raw emotion. Albert, seeing the depth of her pain, felt a pang of remorse for the role he had played in her suffering. The confrontation was cathartic but also destructive, pushing their relationship to the breaking point. Rosa and Albert were left with a newfound clarity about the extent of their past betrayals and the impact they had on each other's lives. Their once complicated relationship had now reached a place where resolution seemed impossible, leaving Rosa to grapple with the reality of her shattered past and uncertain future. Just as the investigation seemed to be at an impasse, a new lead emerged that shifted the focus and renewed hope for finding Pedro's killer. A thorough review of surveillance footage from the area surrounding the Foix Reservoir revealed a key piece of evidence: a figure, cloaked in darkness, who was seen near the crime scene on the night Pedro's body was discovered. This new suspect, initially captured only as a shadowy silhouette, was identified through enhanced video analysis and witness testimonies. The figure was linked to a known criminal organization that had been on the radar of law enforcement for some time. It became clear that this suspect had connections to the same underworld network Pedro had been involved with. The investigation team zeroed in on this individual, whose criminal history and current whereabouts made them a strong candidate for further interrogation. The suspect was a former associate of Pedro's, someone who had a clear motive for involvement in the crime. The nature of their relationship with Pedro suggested that he may have been involved in a dispute over a large sum of money or a betrayal that led to Pedro's demise. This breakthrough brought a new layer of complexity to the case, as it indicated that Pedro's death was not just a result of his personal entanglements but also tied to larger criminal operations. As the investigation delved deeper into the suspect's background and activities, more information about Pedro's final hours began to surface. Witnesses who lived near the reservoir came forward with details that painted a chilling picture of Pedro's last moments. According to their accounts, Pedro had been seen in a heated argument with an unidentified individual shortly before his death. The confrontation was described as intense and volatile, with Pedro appearing desperate and fearful. Further examination of Pedro's phone records and digital communications revealed that he had been in contact with the suspect in the days leading up to his death. Text messages and calls between them suggested a level of urgency and tension, hinting at a serious issue that Pedro was trying to resolve or escape from. The final communication between Pedro and the suspect was a message that read, "I can't do this anymore. Meet me tonight." Forensic evidence from the crime scene provided additional insight. Analysis of the charred remains and the chemical accelerant used in the fire indicated a deliberate attempt to destroy any evidence linking the suspect to the crime. This suggested that Pedro's death was carefully planned and executed, possibly as part of a larger scheme to silence him or eliminate a liability. The details of Pedro's final hours painted a vivid and disturbing picture. It became apparent that he had been involved in a high-stakes conflict that culminated in his brutal murder. The combination of the new lead and the emerging details about his last moments provided the investigation with a clearer direction, but also raised questions about how far the conspiracy around Pedro's life and death extended. As the investigation team prepared to confront the new suspect, the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. The case had evolved from a personal tragedy into a complex criminal investigation with multiple layers of deceit and betrayal. With this revelation, the pursuit of justice for Pedro took on a new urgency, as the team sought to uncover the full extent of the corruption and violence that had led to his untimely demise. As the investigation continued to unravel, the focus unexpectedly turned towards Rosa, casting a shadow of suspicion over her. The new evidence and the suspect's connections to Pedro revealed a network of deceit, but the authorities began to piece together a theory that implicated Rosa in Pedro's death. The theory suggested that Rosa might have been more involved than previously thought. Surveillance footage, combined with witness statements, hinted at interactions between Rosa and the suspect. The investigation team began to question whether Rosa had been part of a larger conspiracy to either aid Pedro's criminal activities or to orchestrate his demise. The notion that she might have been involved in Pedro's final confrontation or had prior knowledge of the plan started to take shape. The allegations were shocking to Rosa, who had always maintained her innocence and been a diligent part of the investigation team. She felt blindsided by the accusations and deeply hurt by the implication that she could have played a role in Pedro's murder. The Internal Affairs Unit conducted a thorough and public scrutiny of her actions, further fueling the media frenzy and painting her as a central figure in the scandal. Rosa was forced to defend herself against mounting evidence that seemed to point in her direction. Her colleagues were torn between their professional duty and personal loyalty, creating an atmosphere of mistrust and isolation for Rosa. She was subjected to intense questioning and scrutiny, her every action and decision being examined for any sign of complicity. Albert, already reeling from his own complicated emotions and involvement in the case, began to show signs of increasing paranoia. The pressure of the investigation, combined with his unresolved issues with Rosa, started to affect his judgment and behavior. He became more erratic, struggling to come to terms with the possibility that Rosa might be implicated. His paranoia was exacerbated by the media's portrayal of the case and the public's growing doubts about Rosa's integrity. Albert found himself drawn into the conspiracy theories and rumors circulating about the case, becoming increasingly convinced that there were hidden forces at play. This led him to take drastic actions in an attempt to protect Rosa and uncover what he believed to be the real truth behind the murder. Albert's involvement in the case grew more entangled as he began to conduct his own investigation, often crossing legal and ethical boundaries. He started to follow leads that were not officially sanctioned, seeking out information from dubious sources and even confronting individuals who might have had connections to Pedro's criminal activities. His actions were driven by a mix of desperation and a misguided sense of justice, pushing him further into a dangerous and uncharted territory. The combination of Albert's paranoia and Rosa's mounting legal troubles created a volatile situation. Rosa, already under immense stress from the accusations, was further destabilized by Albert's increasingly reckless behavior. Their relationship, already strained, deteriorated further as Albert's actions seemed to complicate Rosa's situation rather than help it. As the investigation progressed, the stakes became higher, and the lines between guilt and innocence blurred. Rosa and Albert found themselves caught in a crossfire of suspicion and betrayal, each struggling to clear their names while navigating a web of corruption and deceit. The tension reached a boiling point, leaving both of them facing uncertain futures and questioning the true extent of their involvement in Pedro's tragic death. As the investigation into Pedro's death deepened, a new layer of complexity emerged. Rosa's loyalty to Pedro, once considered a point of emotional and personal conflict, was now under scrutiny from multiple angles. The authorities began to question whether Rosa's dedication to Pedro had clouded her judgment and whether she had been complicit in his criminal activities or even his death. Internal Affairs and the media seized on the narrative that Rosa's personal feelings for Pedro had potentially led her to ignore or even participate in his illicit dealings. Witnesses came forward, suggesting that Rosa might have been involved in some of Pedro's dealings, either knowingly or unwittingly. This included testimonies about suspicious interactions and questionable decisions Rosa made while working with Pedro. The investigation team began to piece together evidence that seemed to suggest Rosa had been more closely involved with Pedro's criminal network than she had previously admitted. This included financial transactions that linked her to funds associated with Pedro's criminal activities, as well as witness accounts of her presence at meetings or events connected to Pedro's underworld dealings. Rosa was thrust into a defensive position, forced to clarify her role and motivations. Her once clear commitment to her job and her fight for justice were now overshadowed by allegations that she might have had a deeper, more personal involvement in Pedro's criminal life. The emotional and psychological toll of defending herself against these accusations further strained her already fragile state. As Rosa grappled with the accusations, the investigation team continued to dig into the truth behind Pedro's connections to organized crime. The evidence began to paint a more detailed picture of Pedro's involvement with the criminal underworld, revealing the extent and nature of his activities. Detailed financial records and surveillance reports uncovered Pedro's role in a sophisticated criminal network that spanned several key operations in Barcelona. He was found to be deeply involved in money laundering, drug trafficking, and illegal arms trading. His connections to organized crime were not just superficial but integral to the operations of the criminal groups he was linked with. The investigation also revealed that Pedro's involvement went beyond mere association. He was a significant player within the network. He had acted as a go-between for criminal organizations and had used his position as a police officer to shield these activities from law enforcement. His betrayal of his badge and his engagement in criminal activities had far-reaching consequences, affecting the lives of many and undermining the trust in the police force. The unraveling of Pedro's criminal connections exposed a network of corruption and deceit that went beyond his personal dealings. It involved high-level figures in both the criminal and legal communities, creating a complex web of betrayal and danger. The implications were severe, suggesting that Pedro's murder might have been part of a larger scheme to eliminate someone who was a threat to the stability of the criminal enterprise. As the truth about Pedro's criminal activities came to light, the investigation faced new challenges. Rosa, already under immense pressure, was now seen as a potential pawn in a much larger game. The focus of the investigation shifted towards understanding how Pedro's criminal actions had led to his death and who stood to gain from his elimination. The revelations not only affected Rosa's standing but also reshaped the investigation's trajectory. The complexity of the case deepened as the team sought to uncover the full extent of Pedro's connections and the motives behind his murder. Betrayed loyalties and hidden agendas were at the forefront of the investigation, leaving Rosa and others involved in a precarious position as they navigated the dangerous waters of crime and corruption. The tension between Rosa and Albert reached its breaking point. Rosa, desperate for clarity and resolution, decided to confront Albert about their tumultuous past and his potential involvement in Pedro's death. Their meeting took place in a secluded, dimly lit cafe, away from prying eyes and the relentless media scrutiny. Rosa, her face etched with a mix of determination and despair, looked directly at Albert. "Albert, I need to know the truth. About everything. About Pedro's death, and about what you were really involved in." Albert, his demeanor reflecting a mix of guilt and defensiveness, struggled to maintain his composure. "Rosa, I didn't plan for any of this. I didn't mean for things to get this out of control. Yes, I was involved, but it's not as simple as it seems." Rosa's eyes blazed with frustration. "Not as simple as it seems. Pedro is dead, Albert. And you've been acting like a shadow, manipulating everything from the sidelines. Did you have a hand in his death? Did you betray him as you betrayed me?" Albert's face contorted with a pained expression. I didn't want to get caught up in all of this. I was trying to protect you, to keep you safe from the mess Pedro was involved in. But I got pulled in deeper than I ever anticipated." Rosa's voice trembled with emotion. "You should have stayed away if you cared at all. Instead, you chose to manipulate every situation, to play both sides. And now, because of your actions, Pedro is dead, and I'm left trying to piece together the wreckage of our lives." Albert's response was fraught with regret. "I was trying to protect us, Rosa. My involvement was meant to be limited. But when Pedro's criminal connections began to unravel, I was dragged into the center of it. I made mistakes, but I didn't want this to happen." The confrontation revealed the depth of Albert's involvement and the complexity of his motives. He admitted to trying to control the situation from behind the scenes, but his actions had inadvertently contributed to Pedro's downfall. Rosa was faced with the painful realization that Albert's attempts to shield her had only made things worse. As Rosa and Albert's confrontation unfolded, new revelations emerged that shattered the remaining illusions of their relationship. Albert admitted that he had been involved in Pedro's criminal activities to some extent, but it was a desperate attempt to salvage his own position and protect his interests. Albert's confessions included details about how he had tried to manipulate the situation to his advantage, hoping to leverage Pedro's downfall to secure his own future. His actions, driven by a mix of paranoia and self-preservation, had led him to make dangerous decisions, contributing to the chain of events that resulted in Pedro's murder. Rosa, reeling from the revelations, grappled with the realization that her past with both Pedro and Albert was more entangled and toxic than she had ever imagined. The betrayal and deceit that characterized their relationships were more profound and damaging than she had anticipated. The final revelations exposed how Pedro's criminal world had manipulated and exploited their personal lives, leading to a tragic culmination. The truth that came to light forced Rosa to confront the harsh reality of their toxic triangle. Her relationship with Albert, once marked by love and trust, was now tainted by manipulation and betrayal. Pedro's role in the criminal world had been more deeply intertwined with their personal lives than anyone had realized, and his death had been a catalyst that revealed the full extent of the corruption and deceit. As the story came to a close, Rosa was left to navigate the aftermath of these revelations. The core of their toxic triangle had been exposed, leaving her to pick up the pieces of her shattered life and come to terms with the devastating impact of the betrayals that had defined her relationships. The final stand against the truth had changed everything, leaving Rosa to forge a new path amidst the wreckage of her past. As the investigation neared its conclusion, a startling twist emerged that altered the course of the case. The authorities, having pieced together the complex web of deceit surrounding Pedro's murder, uncovered a crucial piece of evidence that had remained hidden until the final stages of the investigation. The twist came in the form of a confidential informant, who had previously been silent about their involvement. This informant revealed that Pedro's murder was not solely the result of his criminal activities or the personal vendettas of Rosa or Albert. Instead, it was orchestrated by a powerful figure within the criminal underworld who had been manipulating events from behind the scenes. The informant disclosed that this figure, a high-ranking member of an international crime syndicate, had seen Pedro as a liability and had orchestrated his murder to eliminate him as a threat. The syndicate's influence had extended to manipulating key players in the case, including Albert, who had been unknowingly used as a pawn in their larger scheme. This revelation shifted the focus of the investigation from the personal conflicts between Rosa, Albert, and Pedro to a broader conspiracy involving global criminal networks. The unexpected twist revealed that the true masterminds behind Pedro's murder were far beyond the local sphere of influence and had been pulling strings to ensure their objectives were met. The public reaction to the conclusion of the case was a mix of shock and disillusionment. The revelation of the international crime syndicate's involvement brought to light the extent of corruption and manipulation that had pervaded the investigation. The media frenzy, which had previously focused on the scandalous details of Pedro's death and the personal failings of Rosa and Albert, now shifted to a broader examination of the global criminal networks at play. Rosa, though ultimately exonerated from direct involvement in Pedro's murder, was left grappling with the fallout of her association with the case. Her reputation had been tarnished by the earlier accusations and the scandal that had surrounded her personal life. While she was vindicated in the sense that the true orchestrators were revealed, the damage to her career and personal life was significant. Albert's role in the case was seen as one of tragic misjudgment rather than deliberate malice. His involvement in the crime was viewed as a result of manipulation by the larger criminal network rather than intentional wrongdoing. However, his actions and decisions were scrutinized, leading to a nuanced public perception of his character. The final judgment of the scandal was marked by a sense of disillusionment with the justice system and the pervasive reach of organized crime. The case had exposed vulnerabilities within law enforcement and the legal system, raising questions about how such powerful networks could influence and undermine justice. In the end, the case of Pedro's murder concluded with a sobering realization of the complex and often hidden forces at work in criminal investigations. The public's final judgment reflected a blend of relief that the true masterminds had been exposed and a profound sense of regret over the personal and systemic failures that had led to the tragic events. The ashes of the scandal left a lasting impact on those involved and a stark reminder of the pervasive influence of global criminal enterprises. In the wake of the investigation's conclusion, Rosa and Albert faced the profound impact of the scandal on their lives and futures. The exposure of the international crime syndicate's involvement and the complexities of their personal roles left a lasting imprint on both individuals. For Rosa, the aftermath was a mixture of relief and ongoing struggle. Although she was cleared of direct involvement in Pedro's murder, the scandal had severely damaged her reputation and career. She was reinstated to her position within the police department but faced a challenging road to rebuild her trust with colleagues and the public. The personal toll on Rosa was significant. Her relationships, once vibrant and supportive, were now strained. The emotional scars from the investigation and the media scrutiny left her feeling isolated. She sought therapy and support to cope with the trauma and to regain her sense of self and professional identity. Rosa chose to channel her experience into a renewed commitment to justice and transparency. She became an advocate for reform within the police department, using her experience to push for changes that would prevent similar corruption and misconduct in the future. Her advocacy work brought her a measure of redemption and respect, though the path to healing remained long and arduous. Albert's post-investigation life was marked by introspection and attempts at redemption. His involvement in the case, while ultimately seen as the result of manipulation rather than intentional malice, left him grappling with the consequences of his actions. His career was left in disarray, and he struggled to find a new path in a field that had been deeply tainted by the scandal. Albert took time to reflect on his role and sought to make amends. He engaged in counseling to address his actions and decisions, and he publicly acknowledged his mistakes. His efforts to redeem himself included working with organizations focused on combating organized crime, aiming to use his experience to contribute to positive change. The relationship between Rosa and Albert, once marked by love and betrayal, was now strained but remained intact on a professional level. They occasionally crossed paths as they worked on different aspects of reform and justice, and though their personal connection was irreparably altered, they found a shared purpose in advocating for a more transparent and accountable system. The scandal had a profound impact on the police department, leading to significant changes and reforms. The exposure of corruption and the influence of organized crime forced a re-evaluation of internal practices and oversight mechanisms. In response to the scandal, the department underwent a comprehensive review of its practices. New protocols were implemented to strengthen oversight and accountability. This included increased transparency in investigations, stricter guidelines for handling sensitive cases, and enhanced internal audits to prevent future corruption. The department also focused on rebuilding public trust. Community outreach programs were established to improve relationships between law enforcement and the public. These programs aimed to address concerns, rebuild confidence, and demonstrate a commitment to integrity and fairness. The scandal also led to broader changes in how law enforcement agencies dealt with organized crime. Collaboration with international agencies was strengthened to address the global nature of criminal networks and to improve intelligence sharing and coordination. Training programs were introduced to better prepare officers for dealing with complex cases involving high-stakes corruption and organized crime. The aim was to equip law enforcement personnel with the skills and knowledge needed to navigate such challenges effectively. The process of rebuilding trust was slow and required ongoing effort. The police department faced the challenge of proving its commitment to reform and transparency while addressing the lingering skepticism from the public and media. In summary, the aftermath of the investigation saw Rosa and Albert navigating the personal and professional fallout from the scandal. Their experiences shaped their paths toward redemption and advocacy. The police department, in turn, took critical steps toward reform and rebuilding trust, facing the long-term task of ensuring integrity and accountability within its ranks. The legacy of the scandal left a lasting impact on both individuals and institutions, underscoring the need for vigilance and reform in the fight against corruption and crime.